Hello, this is Phenomenology, and my name is Mark Thorsby. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Martin Heidegger's seminal text, Being in Time. We're going to be taking a look at part four of Division One, where Heidegger discusses ultimately the question of what it means to be with others in the world. In fact, in particular, the name of this section is Being in the World as being with, and being oneself, the they. So ultimately, we're going to see here that Heidegger is going to continue to expand and develop his conception of Dasein. Recall previously from the other video lectures that for Heidegger, Dasein is a being in the world, and that's really constitutive for understanding what it means to be a being for whom being is an issue. And Heidegger's looked at the question of the worldhood as such, and we looked at the question of the environment. And we've talked about the ready at hand, and Heidegger's been continually developing his conception of what being in the world is. We're going to see that in this section, he's going to be looking at the question of being with as sort of the fundamental ontological primordial investigation that he's going to be doing. But we're going to end this section here with Heidegger announcing something that's really, really fundamental to his entire ontology, and that is his conception of the they. So that's sort of what we're going to be taking a look at in this video. So welcome back, and I hope you enjoy this video. It'll probably be a bit shorter because this section is a bit shorter in Heidegger. So what are some of the things we've left off with? Well, at this point, it should be clear to all of us that Dasein is fascinated and absorbed into the world in terms of involvement. And here, remember, we've had this really fundamental conception of Heidegger's in which he articulates a mode of Dasein's being in terms of the ready to hand, where things are treated in terms of their use. And this is really fundamental to understanding how Dasein, in its average everyday sense, in the sort of normal course of affairs, how Dasein actually exists. And things are not considered, things are not objects, or other beings are not encountered as present to hand, but rather ready to hand. Now, what we're going to be looking at to start with here is the question of, well, who exactly is Dasein? And we've talked about that in the previous video here, but who is Dasein? Well, the answer to the question who here is going to concern the structure of Dasein's being in its average everydayness. Now, this is a continual theme that Heidegger is reiterating as he goes through the text. So at this point, you should be fairly familiar or none too surprised by Heidegger's emphasis here that this is an existential investigation. We're going to see three really big concepts sort of come into play here. The biggest and most important here is what Heidegger is going to call the Mitsein, or being with. This is, of course, the German term. The German term being, sein, and mit means with, so it literally means being with. The other time here is what it means to be with Dasein, right? Or mit Dasein. So Heidegger is going to make a pretty important distinction here and talk about the idea that we're with other beings in the world when we're in the ready to hand, but there is something fundamentally different about being with other beings that are like ourselves, being with other people, or being with other Daseins, remember, and that's really his sort of term for humanness, though they don't mean the same thing. It's his ontological signification of the kinds of beings that we are. And then another term which probably isn't going to be as important or crucial to your understanding of Heidegger, but is important for this section, is his conception of the Selbstsein. That's being oneself. I don't think there's supposed to be apostrophe there, so my apologies. But being oneself. What does it mean to be ourselves? And interestingly enough, we're going to see Heidegger really start with this first conception here. Now, to jump into it, we're starting off here with paragraph 25, where Heidegger evaluates or articulates an approach to the existential question of the who of Dasein. So let's just ask ourselves, who is Dasein? And remember, we've defined Dasein as the being for whom being is an issue. And of course, this is also a phenomenological investigation. So that means that I have to ask, well, who is Dasein within the phenomenological sphere? Well, I'm the one asking the question. I'm the one who's concerned with the sort of philosophy of existence here. So I myself am Dasein. So who is Dasein in the most direct sense? I myself am Dasein. Now, on the one hand, we can understand the I myself in terms of I'm a self, I'm a subject. And of course, this term self is ordinary colloquial language, but we also think of ourselves as subjects. And this is a philosophical evaluation of the self, where I sort of sometimes tell my students that you can think of the subjective as you're the subject of your own story. We're the subjects. You're the one who's experiencing all of this, and so Dasein is you, whatever that is, right? Now the self is something that's self-same in a manifold otherness. Heidegger gives this on page 114 of the Heideggerian pagination. And this is, I think, worth considering. The self is something that's self-same in manifold otherness. That is, within our experience, we are experiencing a whole manifold and a variety of otherness, things which are not ourselves, right? In fact, it's the things which are not ourselves that ultimately allow us to delimit and understand what it means to be ourselves, right? It's only by knowing what I am not that I understand what I am. So there is this sort of, I love this, it's sort of a beautiful dichotomy of otherness and alterity that's outside of us. And the self is somehow composed or related to that juxtaposition. We're going to see later on, after we finish, remember in this video series, we're not going to finish all of Heidegger's conception of being in time, but because we're going to be moving on to look at Emmanuel Levinas's text, Totality and Infinity. And for Levinas, otherness, alterity is the essential ingredient. So when you see Heidegger talking about this language, this will become an important sort of touchstone for the philosophy that comes later, right? So there is another good quote that I think is worth mentioning here. When we ask the question of who Dasein is, we have to understand what who means. And Heidegger tells us that the who is what maintains itself as something identical through changes in experience and ways of behavior, and which relates itself to this changing multiplicity in so doing. So when I talk about myself, who am I? One of the things, whatever it is that I am that thing that remains despite the plurality of my experiences. And it's not just the thing which remains, but it's also the thing which relates itself to the change, which understands itself as that which is changing, right? Ontologically, Heidegger says, we understand it ourselves, right, the self, as something which is in each case already constantly present at hand, both in and for a closed realm, and which lists, whoops, that's a sort of mistake, which lists as at the basis, in a very special sense, as the subjectum. So I apologize, somehow I made a mistake there. But this is important here, is we do have a sense in which we are subjects, and he calls this the subjectum. You're going to see that Heidegger doesn't like the language of subjectivity and objectivity for reasons which we've actually discussed. But there is a sense in which I, as a self, am constantly present at hand. Now, notice when we've talked to the present at hand, we've meant the present at hand to be an ontological distinction, but ultimately related to his phenomenology here, right? Where, for instance, here I have a water bottle, and so if I'm working out, exercising, and I'm using this water bottle, right? The bottle is encountered in its being as something which is available as equipment. It's something for me to use, right? But when I consider what the bottle is in itself, when I try to understand the essence of the bottle or something, and think here of the whole Platonic Western philosophy discourse, when I try to think of the essence of the bottle, then the bottle becomes present to hand. But when here Heidegger is saying that the subject, whatever it is that I am, is something that's always present to hand. Now here, I think we should understand here that Heidegger means this in a sort of, it doesn't mean we're always conscious of ourselves as ourselves, but what it means is that we are always present, right? We are, if the self is that which remains identical through the changes that we experience, then that means that the self is always present. And therefore, in a almost an a prioritic sense, the self as a subject constantly remains present at hand. But what's interesting here is there's a way in which, even though the self is always present at hand, because the self is, if you will, that which conjoins the experiences I'm having, the self is not always attended to in the present to hand. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, let's keep going here. The self remains present. See another. I apologize here. The self remains present to hand, whether explicitly or not. So Heidegger recognizes that same sort of problem I was trying to articulate in terms of explicitity, right? Something is explicit when I'm thinking of myself as a subject. Then the self becomes explicit. When I'm thinking of the water bottle, right, and the ready to hand, the self is inexplicit, right? It's not obvious, right? But it's still there. It still remains. It's what, Husserl might call a sort of phenomenological residuum. And here you can think of, well, there's two key ingredients to my conception of the self. Well, the first is, of course, consciousness, but the other is substantiality, substance, right? The fact that I'm also a being that has a substantial, that has substance, that in that substance is what links me to the world, right? Because I'm a being in the world. So substantiality is an important character trait here, or not even a character trait, it's more fundamental or primordial than that, right? But substantiality ultimately for Heidegger is an important clue for understanding and explicating Dasein's being. Now we get another question, we get another comment here on 115, in which Heidegger says, yet presence at hand is the kind of being of Dasein which belongs to entities whose character is not that of Dasein. So you can see here is the sort of difference here is even when I'm considering the bottle as something which is present at hand, um, or in the ready to hand, either way, I mean that differently than what I seem to mean when I talk about myself as a self, right? Heidegger suggests that it could be that the who of everyday Dasein just is the I myself. We're going to see that he's going to go further than that ultimately, and he's going to argue eventually that the essence of who I am ultimately resides in others. And so this is going to be a sort of fascinating, on the one hand, beautiful, on the other hand, terrifying hypothesis. Now, but let's keep closer with the text, right? The first thing he says here is that Heidegger is well aware that within Western philosophy and within discussions of personal identity, for instance, there is a lot of skepticism, beginning first with Locke's conception of personal identity, and especially after Hume's acceleration of Locke's conception of identity, to the point that Hume, if you recall, argues that identity is a grammatical fiction. I'm having all of these experiences, but I never experience the self that is doing the experiencing. And so I can't be certain that there really is a self that's doing the experiencing. So all I have is a sort of hodgepodge of experiences that are sort of linked together through a temporal sequence or something. Now, Heidegger is aware of the philosophical questions and critique of the self and identity, but in an existential self, when we think about Dasein in terms of how Dasein exists in its average everydayness, the I is given as indubitable, right? It's taken as something that's obviously there, right? And here we have to recognize here that Heidegger is giving an existential articulation to the problem of personal identity here. And so in this regard, the I is something which is indubitable. Now, he also wants to delimit his conception here. It says that really we're talking about a sort of formal reflective awareness of the I. So the I in this sense is not maybe what we think of when I go to the grocery store and I say I'm buying groceries. There's a whole sort of history that goes with the I there. For him, we're just talking about the formal reflective awareness that the I seems to be capable of. And that seems to be indubitable for Dasein. Right? So a question occurs here for him, which is, does the I disclose Dasein even and especially when Dasein says that it is not the I? Right? So there's a way in which Dasein, as a being that's involved in the world, is not concerned with the I. And there's ways which in Dasein, in its concernful manner, the way in which we deal with things in the world, is not really the I. So it looks like the I is something that's more primordial. Now think of the ready to hand here, the way in which the bottle I drink, etc. Right? The way in which I might just drink from the bottle of water there. The irony here is I actually have a cup of water with ice, but But when I just grab the water and drink it, something is ready to hand, and Dasein is not concerned with the I. It's not concerned with the being of itself. But he's going to argue that it still discloses itself even when we're not aware of it. So Dasein is in each case mind, and this is its constitution, right? The word I is to be understood only as a formal indicator, even not I indicates the I. So for instance, imagine if a person says, let's say, for instance, someone walks into a room where you're at and someone asks, are you the doctor? And you say, I'm not the doctor. You're saying what you are not, but even in saying what you are not, you are still formally indicating that you are an I, just not the I of designation. So there's a way in which the I remains present even when it's not explicit. You can see Heidegger's trying to clarify that distinction between the explicit and the inexplicit here. Now, Heidegger keeps going on 116. He argues, our task is to make visible phenomenally the species to which this Dasein with, this mit Dasein in its closest everydayness belongs, and to interpret it in a way which is ontologically appropriate. So the goal here is to understand the being of being with things ontologically. Now, proximally, the who of Dasein is not a problem ontologically. Even ontically, it remains concealed, right? So, I'm sorry, it's not only a problem ontologically, even ontically it remains concealed. Now, remember here when we talked about the ontological difference, that's the difference between beings versus being, right? So, ontic refers to the beings, and ontology refers to being itself, the existence as such, right? So when we hear Heidegger saying this, he wants to, when we hear Heidegger or when we read Heidegger writing this or whatnot, what he's saying is that there's an ontological problem here, but because of the way in which the I doesn't disclose itself, there's also an ontic problem, right? So we have a sort of double question going on here. Because if the I is an essential characteristic of Dasein, then it is the one which must be interpreted existentially. So here's a great key passage that I really liked and I wanted to throw your way, which comes from Heidegger's Pagination 117, quote, the entity in question at bottom, the kind of being which belongs to something present at hand, even if one is far from attributing to it the solidity of an occurrent corporeal thing, yet man's substance is not spirit as a synthesis of soul and body, it is rather existence, right? So he's saying here that even if we don't believe in the corporeal body and we're idealist in Berkeley's sense or something like this, right, the I represents a substance, and that substance is existential. It's not a combination of soul and body. And it's not necessarily a corporeal thing. What we're talking about here is the existential nature of Dasein itself, right? So let's move here to paragraph 26. The Dasein with of others in everyday being with. Now keep in mind here that when he says Dasein with, the term here is mit Dasein, and the term being with is mit sein, right? So the previous argument that we've attended to is that the environment is that which is around Dasein and its everydayness, right? The environment is the Umwelt, it's the around world. Now, Dasein and the ready to hand, Dasein is involved with that Umwelt regarding the useful nature according to Dasein's concernful dealings in the place where Dasein dwells, right? So that means that Dasein gets surrounded by one, equipment, things to use, like the water bottle, or the pen, or the book, or whatever, right? On the one hand, Dasein is surrounded by equipment, but on the other hand, Dasein is surrounded by others, right? And we're going to see here that for Heidegger, others should not be understood existentially as just other things, right? There's a difference here between equipment and others. In fact, every reference of equipment is always a reference to another. Heidegger gives sort of an example here. So for instance, I have this water bottle. You'll probably notice that this is a water bottle, a bicycle water bottle. A bicycle is always in reference to a bicyclist, right? Heidegger gives the example, he says, when I walk around in the field, say I'm walking around a fence, the field that someone else owns, that fence tells me that there's another person, another other involved. So In fact, all of this equipment is all bound up by reference to others, to other beings who are like ourselves. And now, for instance, pause the video and look around wherever it is you're sitting. You have a computer. Well, computers are for others, right? So there's a reference to others, right? Or if I'm on a Mac, so there's a reference to Steve Jobs, for instance, right? Curtains, uh, I'm looking at curtains before me right now. You can't see them, but I can see them. And these curtains are in reference to the idea of closing the shades for others, right? So otherness, the other beings, even when they're not present, are actually always somehow wrapped up in my concernful dealings with equipment. So in the ready to hand, others are actually a constituent feature. And the question here is, can we clarify what that constituent feature is? And can we understand the threshold difference between being with others on the one hand, other Dasseins, and just being with just equipment, being with other basic beings on the other? Heidegger gives a quotation here. The others who are thus encountered in the ready-to-hand environmental context of equipment are not somehow added on in thought to some thing which is proximately just present at hand. Such things, like water bottles and pens and curtains, are encountered out of the world in which they are ready to hand for others. A world which is always mine too in advance, right? So in the ready to hand, when I encounter other things to use, other beings ontically, right, those beings have a reference to others because they're available to me in the same sense that they're available to others, right? So there's a commonality to the world, right? And this, of course, is what it means to be a being in the world with others, right? Now, a couple quotations I thought were important, and sort of just listed some of them out here. That should be 118. Is by others we do not mean everyone else but me, those over against whom the eye stands out. They are rather those from whom, for the most part, one does not distinguish oneself, those among whom one is too. And Heidegger has this very interesting way in which he's going to understand the relationship here, is ultimately is the way in which we can talk about being with others, mit Dasein, right? This actually, being with others is the way in which I understand what it is that I am in my solitude, right? So it's very sort of interesting here. And he's going to say that these concepts of with and to, these are existential concepts. These are not categories, or he says, don't understand them categorially, understand them existentially. So when I'm with others, that means I'm existing with others. What does that mean? So we're not categorizing the others here. We're understanding the way in the existential, or I guess it's the existential interpretation of others. Now, when others are encountered, the world of Dasein is a with world, right? And we sort of got that in a previous passage here. But when others are encountered, it is not the case that one's own subject is proximally present at hand, right? So think about when you meet someone at the grocery store. Say, for instance, you say, "Can you hand me that basket?" And you're talking to someone, right? The way in which others encounter is not a way in which the subject. I don't. When I ask the person for the basket and I encounter that person, I don't encounter their subjectivity. I don't encounter the sense in which they are present to hand to themselves, right? That we described earlier. So it's not a subjectivity appropriation or relation here, right? He says they are encountered from out of the world environmentally. That is, they come from the outside to me, as it were. And so it's a different way of articulating it. And you can see Heidegger is trying to move us along and away from this sort of traditional subject-object split mode of interpreting Dasein's being with others. Now, even when Dasein explicitly addresses itself as I'm right here, this locative personal designation must be understood in terms of Dasein's spatiality. Now, remember, spatiality for Dasein is a term that designates the modes and the ways in which Dasein is involved with the world, right? Spatiality doesn't mean three-dimensional time-space, though, because three-dimensional time-space is grounded upon the existential movement of Dasein in terms of its involvement with other beings. Now, with regard to others in the world, Dasein does not speak towards itself, but speaks from itself, right? And you can see here he's trying to get away from this um, solipsistic sense in which, for instance, Husserl to a certain degree and others see that since we're only the subjects, when we speak, it's always about the ego. And here he's saying, no, 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 right? It's not that I'm speaking towards myself, I'm speaking from myself outwards into the world. Now, others are not encountered as person things that are present at hand. We meet them at work. That is primarily in their being in the world, right? So you see here that we're primarily with others in terms of the ready to hand, where we're involved in terms of others being and their being with the world in terms of involvement, right? And this is the Mit-Dasein conception here that he begins to articulate. Now, for Heidegger, the phenomenological assertion of Dasein, the phenomenological assertion that Dasein is essentially being with, has an existential ontological meaning. It is something which turns up in every case by reason of the occurrence of others. Being with, right, Mitsein is an existential characteristic of Dasein, even when factically no other is present at hand or perceived. For instance, in something I've written previously, I talk about phenomenologically in terms of Robinson Crusoe. You probably know Robinson Crusoe's the story about a gentleman who's marooned on an island all by himself. Now, eventually he meets other people and this sort of stuff. But when he's all by himself on the island, right? My argument, and Heidegger would agree here, is that even when there are no others present to me, the world of my involvement still will reference others as such. So one cannot escape Mit-Dasein. One cannot escape being with others, even when there is no present at hand or perception of another. The other can be missing only in and for a being with. So we can talk about someone not being somewhere, someone missing, but they're missing in terms of they're not in somewhere, they're not for something, right? Mit-Dasein is encountered in a mode in which they, the other people, or others, are indifferent and alien. Wow, I can see I have a lot of typos here, so I apologize. Right? But here he sort of recognized that we, in the ready-to-hand sort of average everyday involvement, when we see others, they're indifferent, they're alien, right? And they're not alien totally in the sense that I recognize that they're also like me, they're Dasein, right? But I sort of work with them, but it's the manner of my concernful involvement that's at hand, and I'm sort of indifferent to them, and they're just outside of me, as it were. They're alien to me. Now, Heidegger says that there's a sort of two differences here, and he's introducing this new term for us, solicitude. Now, care, you'll recall, is a mode of Dasein's being in the world, and regards the concernful dealings in the place where Dasein dwells, right? So concern is the primary mode that Heidegger's articulated so far regarding what it means for Dasein to be in a world. Dasein's concern and has care for things, etc., etc. All of this comes out of his discussion of the ready to hand. Now, solicitude is ultimately Heidegger's designation for the mode by which I encounter others. Remember, I encounter others as alien and indifferent to me. I don't encounter them in the way in which I encounter the things I'm caring for, right? Think of when you're walking down in a marketplace or in a mall and you're seeing other people who you don't know, right? For the most part, they're just indifferent beings, right? They're not like objects, they're not just things, but there's a way in which in the average everyday they're just out there, right? And so he wants to describe this in terms of, you can see solitude on the one hand is sort of at the root here, solicitude. Now, solicitude is an existential expression for Dasein's indifferent modes of being, the way in which Dasein can be indifferent to other things. I'm sorry, not the way in which Dasein can be indifferent to other things, but the way in which other beings are indifferent to Dasein, right? And this is a modality of Dasein. This is a way of Dasein acting. Others are not taken as things, others are Daseins themselves. So solicitude is the existential mode whereby Dasein designates that it is not the other, right? So this is really sort of important because it's really through the other that Dasein is disclosed as itself. Now, Heidegger talks about there being positive and negative forms of solicitude. More importantly are the positive forms of solicitude. And Heidegger sees solicitude on a sort of spectrum where there's two different ways in which Dasein can, in a positive sense, enact solicitude. On the one hand, Dasein can leap in, he says. And when he says this, he says, when I encounter another person, both of us exist by care in the world, right? So both of us are involved in things, right? But I can leap in for the care of another, right? So that is, I don't like saying join, because that's not the term he uses here, but I can, as it were, modify my being such that I become one organized towards the care of that other, right? But I can also jump ahead, he says, of the case of the care of another, and he calls this forbearance. And so there's a way, considerateness versus forbearance. So when I'm meeting other beings and I'm indifferent to them, I can, on the one extreme, I can leap into their care, and I can relinquish what I'm caring for, and then find myself within the dynamic care consideration of another. I can also do the opposite and let a person's care become authentic to themselves, right, and move ahead of them, leap ahead. And that means he calls this forbearance. So I can, as it were, turn away or move away from the care of another. So you have this sort of matrix of relations that he's trying to describe existentially in terms of considerateness and forbearance. And this is his conception this is the conception of the mode of solicitude. Now, every being with one another maintains itself between the two extremes of positive solicitude, that which leaps in and dominates, and that which leaps forth and liberates, right? Because when you liberate, what you're liberating is the authentic care of another, right? So think about it, for instance, this is sort of a silly, but imagine, for instance, I see someone whose car, maybe they need, there's something wrong with their car, and I stop and try to help them on the road or something, right? I'm jumping in terms of considerateness there, right? And I'm dominating in the sense that I'm letting their concern dominate me, right? But then on the other hand, imagine I'm with someone and I say, well, I don't know how to do it, I'm going to give up and go, and I leave. Then I leave them to be concerned for the care by themselves. That is, I allow the other to gain an authentic mode of care. And this is going to be because he's ultimately going to argue that the inauthentic mode, the primary mode, is actually related in which I give up my authenticity and I dislodge my own sense of care for things. Now, Heidegger launches at the very end of this passage, or section here, on pages 124 to 125, into a critique of empathy. And you'll recall that when we were reading Husserl, and this is important in a lot of Husserl's work, is Husserl articulated a conception of empathy. So for him, Husserl has this conception that when I recognize other beings phenomenologically, that what happens is I recognize based upon their body that they're very similar to me, and then I essentially create a pairing where I pair my sense of consciousness with their movements of their body, and he calls this pairing empathy. And so it's the phenomenological means whereby I can recognize an other as it were, as a type of myself, or I can recognize myself in another, and this is empathy phenomenologically. Husserl talks about this at great length, and so does Edith Stein, Husserl's student, actually. It's worth taking a look at. It's very interesting. But you're going to see here that Heidegger is distancing himself from Husserl, and he gives a criticism, not an outright rejection of empathy, but he argues that the conception of empathy is ultimately the conception of the present at hand, and it lacks the primordial grounding of Dasein in the authentic sense and the inauthentic sense in the ready to hand. He writes, this phenomena which is none too happily designated empathy is then supposed, as it were, to provide the first ontological bridge from one's own subject, which is given proximally as alone, to the other subject, which is proximally closed off, right? And it's this means by which, for Husserl, we're sort of kind of, as it were, separate spheres, and empathy is the sort of ontological bridge that can somehow link us together. Now, Heidegger says, though, but what we've realized is that what we're talking about here is a relationship of Dasein to Dasein. And of course, Dasein has a fundamental structure of being in the world as articulated in terms of care. So that means that it's not just that we're sort of kind of formally, structurally recognizing each other, right? But it's that we recognize the care of another as another, right? So empathy does not first constitute being with, right? It doesn't constitute Mitsein. Only on the basis of Mitsein does empathy become possible. It gets its motivation from the unsociability of the dominant modes of Mitsein. This, of course, is solicitude. Empathy is not a primordial existential phenomena. So you can see here, and later on he says there is a way in which, empathy can sort of be rescued here. But the key here is that the discussion of empathy from the Husserlian sense ultimately misses the point because it doesn't first recognize the existential character and involvement that comes with being in the world. Okay, so there's sort of criticism of ultimately Husserl and Stein and other important phenomenologists. But there's also a sort of rejoinder here. So there's a long, interesting discourse on empathy we're taking a look at. Now, in paragraph 27, Heidegger articulates, the name of this is the everyday beings oneself and the they. So we're going to see here that the really primary concept, and I think really the mammoth results, the big dog, interesting stuff in this chapter is das Man, or the they. And it's going to ultimately consist in Heidegger's articulation that as beings in the world in which we have solicitude as our possibility, most of the time we completely give up our care to another. And the other here is not any particular designated person, it is the other as a whole, the they, das Man, right? Now, Dasein encounters others as what they are, and they are what they do, right? So when I encounter another person, let's say at the grocery store, and they're a grocery clerk, they're stacking vegetables or something, then in that case, Dasein is that being which stacks vegetables at the grocery store, right? And I understand that according to my concernful dealings. And the fact that that other Dasein is stacking vegetables reveals their concernful dealings with the world. Now, being with one another has the character of distantiality. Distantiality. Distantiality is the idea of distancing something, and it's a phenomenological term here. It means something like making the either making the farness. It means something like bringing the farness into view, or something like this, right? And this idea is that when I'm with others, because of solicitude, I'm actually creating, if you will, structures or matrices of distance between myself and others. And that's in my concernful dealings are sort of the thematic by which that distantiality takes its concrete place in the factical mode of Dasein, the way in which we actually sort of live on a factual day-to-day way. Now, Dasein as everyday being with one another stands in subjectum to others. Now, this is where things get really interesting. He says, right, Dasein as everyday being with one another stands in subjectum to others. It itself is not. Its being has been taken away by the others. Dasein's everyday possibilities of being are for the other to dispose of as they please. Now, notice here that because he's articulated this conception of solicitude, Heidegger realizes here that now we have an existential or an ontological way of describing the way in which we allow others to guide us, the way in which we give up our own care to others. And in fact, it's even more radical than that. Others have the ability to take away my being, the possibilities of my being. For instance, here I'm giving an example because after I record this video, I'm supposed to go over to a friend's house where they're having a picnic, right? And on the one hand, well, I want to go and I look forward to seeing everyone. On the other hand, I hate going to things like that. And maybe you're like that. On the one hand, it's fun to go to parties. On the other hand, it's horrible to go to parties. Why? Because when you go to a party or when you're meeting other people, what happens is the possibilities for your existence get usurped by them, right? You have to, as it were, you don't have to, but most of us in a social sense will dissolve our own sense of identity, and then we'll get wrapped up into the concernful dealings with another. So I lose my agency when I go to the party. And so there's a way in which parties are both social, yet on the other hand, they're destructive for Dasein, it's the authentic self. And by the way, this is the difference here, right? Is What happens when I go to a party is when I'm with others, my being can be taken away, and that means that I go from being authentic self to becoming an inauthentic self. I lose my authenticity when I'm with others. So this is a very fascinating sort of conclusion that you probably hadn't maybe considered, because usually when we talk about being with others, it sounds hunky-dory, we're all together. But you can see here that he's saying that when Dasein is with other Daseins, Dasein dissolves its sense of care into the others. And so there's a way in which Dasein loses itself when it's with others. So being with others is actually tantamount in many cases to almost a violent inauthenticity. Um, Now the others here that we're talking about are not definite, so we're not talking about specific people. The who is not this one, it's not that one, it's not oneself, it's not just some people, or it's not the sum of all the people. The who is the neuter, it's the they. Now in German there's three, as if you don't know German or don't speak German, the German language has three different genders, right? You're probably familiar. English doesn't have any gendered words. But for instance, Spanish has masculine and feminine. Well, German has three. It has masculine and feminine. It has the neuter, which means that it's neither. It's sort of just on its own. And he wants to sort of say that think of the others, the who, the das Man, the they, as ultimately this third category that's sort of associated with everyone and no one. And it is the sort of, it is obscure, and yet it is this sense. Think of the way in which, for instance, I remember when I was a kid, I would, I'd sort of I'd do lowriders in my pants because I was a skater, and so I'd skateboard and lower my pants a little bit. Now I was never a good skater, so people who know me really well know that too. But for a little bit I was, and I remember my grandmother telling me, "Why are you doing that? Why are you wearing your pants like that?" And my answer, I don't know what my answer was, but her answer is, what do you think people will think, right? And when she says people, she's not saying, what do you think any one person? She's talking about das Man. She's talking about the they. So whenever people refer to, oh, what will people say? This is the sense in which Heidegger is articulating the they or the das Man. Now, what does Heidegger argue? He says, the being with one another dissolves one's own Dasein completely into the kind of being of the others, right? So we give up the kind of being we are in our own particular self, as our own particular self, and we become the kind of being that the others are. In such a way, indeed, that of the others, as distinguished and explicit, vanish more and more. Now, it's interesting, he also says that, but guess what? We take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they take pleasure. We read, see, and judge literature and art as they see and judge it. Likewise, we shrink back from the great mass as they shrink back. We find shocking what they find shocking. And when I was reading this, especially when he talked about the great masses and the shocking, I couldn't help but think about 9/11. Now, some of the people here are probably watching this maybe too young to remember what it was like to be in the United States during 9/11, and some of you aren't in the United States, and so you wouldn't know either. But after, like most communities, when sort of a great catastrophe has occurred, after 9/11, there was a way in which we all came together, right? We, in fact, use that term. There's a way in which the country came together. And we were all shocked together. But what you could say here is that from Heidegger's perspective, the sort of way in which everyone came together was a sort of grand movement of inauthenticity. We were all giving up our otherness to the others, right? Now, there's something that's beautiful about that on the one hand, but on the other hand, we need to recognize it ontologically as the distantiality of the self from the self, right? It's the dissolving of Dasein's um, own care into the care of others, right? Now, and maybe that's sort of sacrificial, and maybe there's a way to poetically think about that, but I couldn't help but think about that, and to think about also the way in which people who are angry and act in mobs do the same sort of thing, right? So when absorbed in Das Man, quote, everything that is primordial gets glossed over as something that has long been well known. Everything gained by a struggle becomes just something that's manipulated, right? Das Man is a leveling down. Now, it's a leveling down of your own individuality, if you will. Now, leveling down is actually a term that comes from Soren Kierkegaard, or at least that's the English equivalent, where Kierkegaard talks about the way in which the crowd levels us down. And this has been a theme in the existential writings of Kierkegaard as well as Friedrich Nietzsche, where he talks about the herd instinct. And Heidegger's describing the same fundamental thing, right? And what this means is that when we're in Das Mann, the things which are most acute in terms of the being of our experience get sort of glossed over and we sort of lose track of them, right? And I remember, go back to, I think as I'm thinking of my great grandparents here, I remember sitting with my great grandmother once, and when I was a child, and when you're a child, everything is new, everything is fresh. And I remember sitting down with her and asking her questions like, did you know that, I don't remember, like the solar system has 9 planets, and did you know about gravitation? And I'm really interested in how things were working. I remember talking to her, and she just saw them as something that was average and everyday, something that she would already known, sort of, even though she'd never studied it. And that's because there's a sort of Das Mann sense in which that which is primordial to being gets leveled down and abstracted and reduced in the they. And this is why Heidegger will articulate Das Mann in terms of inauthenticity. Now, the sense of the they we're describing here is the same sense of what we might call the public. Distantiality, averageness, and leveling down as ways of being for the they, for Das Mann, constitute what we know as publicness, right? Whoa, here. And then there's another phrase here. By publicness, everything gets obscured, and what has thus been covered up gets passed off as something that's familiar and accessible to everyone. So we have this sense of the public. And now, for instance, consider if you ever watched the television cable news where they always are talking about politics and they're asking about public opinion. What is public opinion? Well, public opinion, there is no such thing as the public, and yet the public seems to function as something which we treat as a criteria for the validity of something in politics. And that reveals that in politics, Das Mann takes sway, right? Everything is obscured on the one hand, and things which maybe have interesting nuances get covered over as something familiar and accessible to everyone. And then sort of to move on here, the they is there alongside everywhere. So Das Mann is everywhere. And Das Mann relinquishes Dasein from its agency. And maybe this explains to a certain degree here why we like to align ourselves with the crowd. Because in an important sense, when one joins the crowd, no one no longer bears responsibility because it's the crowd which does it, right? There's been many well-known cases of horrible instances where people who are in a crowd would witness a crime, both from rape and murder, and do nothing. Why didn't they do anything? Well, here, Heidegger would argue, in the psychologist degree, is that we relinquish ourselves to the they, and since the they is everywhere and nowhere, it's everyone and no one, that means that we lose responsibility. We deshackle ourselves from the obligation to act. Right? So we lose agency in the they. We lose our ability to act as individuals. And this is quite important, especially if you're doing a political philosophy and you want to articulate and understand in a more rigorous sense what political freedom means. And you can see here is that there's a certain way in which we lose agency with Das Mann, and so there's a way in which freedom is curtailed. And so Heidegger doesn't talk about that, but I think there's an interesting line of thought worth following up on. Now, Heidegger does say on 128, Dasein in its everydayness is disburdened by the they, right? And this right, we are no longer burdened by the day. Like, think about global warming and climate change. This is something that's happening everywhere and nowhere too, right? Global climate change is something that we're all responsible for, but yet we can say that, well, everyone else does it too. Everyone else is using greenhouse gases, so it's not my fault, right? We disburden ourselves of that catastrophe by receding ontologically or existentially into the they, right? We comport ourselves as a they. I no longer become Mark, I become just one in the crowd, right? Everyone is the other and no one is himself. The they which supplies the answer to the question of the who of everyday Dasein, is the nobody to whom every Dasein has already surrendered itself in being among one another, right? And so we finally get an articulate answer here regarding who Dasein is. Well, in Dasein's authentic sense, it's present to hand as itself, as Dasein itself, Selbstsein. But in the ready to hand sense, the who of Dasein is nobody, right? And so this is a sort of fascinating description of what this means. So if we were going to describe a final sort of discussion here of Das Mann, we could say that Das Mann is an existential and a primordial phenomena, right? Das Mann concerns how we exist, and it's a primordial phenomena. Das Mann is what distinguishes the authentic self from the inauthentic self. Das Mann is the basis of the authentic self. Now, this is fascinating, and I think maybe would bother some people here, right? Is that since we're beings in the world and we're primarily with others, right? It's not that we have an authentic self and then we have an inauthentic self that's on top of it. Rather, Heidegger suggests that, and because of distantiality and all of this, right? The inauthentic self is rather the basis of the authentic self. Das Mann frees Dasein from the totality of its involvements, and Dasein is what ultimately covers Dasein's being up from itself. So part of you'll recall at the very beginning of the introduction of Being Time, Heidegger talks about the idea that in many ways the question of Dasein's being has been covered up, or it's been hidden from Dasein, and part of that is because of Das Mann, because of the they. Because of ultimately the mode by which we exist is primarily one where we relinquish ourselves. And in doing so, we've covered ourselves up for analysis, right? So to conclude here, authentic being oneself is rather an existential modification of the they as an essential existential. So that means that for him, Das Mann is the essential part of us, and that the existential modification of that is what the authentic self is. And so he's taken this classic difference between authenticity and inauthenticity and essentially reversed it, which is the same ultimate reversal of the difference between essence and existence as well. So that concludes our discussion of, Das Mann, pardon me, sorry. That concludes our discussion of this section, of section 4, being in the world as being with and being oneself, the they. In our next video here, we're going to be taking a look at being in as such. What does it mean to be in? And we're going to see Heidegger really take some radical leaps forward as he discusses the ways in which this Das Mann character that we are ourselves actually fleshes itself out in its real involvements in the world. So that's what we've got going on next time. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys online.